That year's drought did not arrive with thunder, but with a long, drawn-out silence. The land around the Wardell Ranch cracked into thin lines, like wounds no longer bothering to hide. Wind swept across grass cut down to stubble, carrying the dry scent of scorched earth and a familiar weariness, one Matthias Wardell had learned to accept as part of his life. He rose before the sun, not because he still held hope for a new day, but because habit had taken root as deeply as the wooden fences around the corral. Each morning, Matthias walked the dirt path, counted a herd growing thinner by the week, laid a hand on weathered posts, and listened for small sounds to tell him what was still holding on and what was close to giving up. This ranch had been left to him by his father, a legacy heavier than any promise. It kept him here, forced him to stand firm, and during long, sleepless nights, locked him inside an invisible room called duty. News about water came slowly, in fragments. The well level dropped, the old dam seeped, cattle died here and there without noise. The bank remained silent, the kind of silence that told a man a letter would come sooner or later. Matthias did not read letters that had not yet arrived. He was used to being pushed to the edge without needing to look down. At midday, the dirt road leading into the ranch shone harshly under the sun. A horse-drawn coach appeared at the bend, its wheels turning slow, as if weighing whether to go on at all. Matthias stood still, one hand resting on the fence, watching it approach. He did not think of anyone in particular. Only that, in a place like this, very little arrived without bringing trouble with it. The coach stopped, dust settled, then the door opened. Morel Boone stepped down first, her boots touching the ground with the calm of someone who had traveled far enough to no longer rush. She was a grown black woman, steady in her stance, her gaze direct. Her hair was tied back neatly, without ornament. Time had left its marks on her face, not weariness, but layers of patience built one upon another. She did not look around in search of anything. She simply lifted her eyes, and they met Matthias's. There was no greeting, no embrace, no joy, no reproach. Only a silence so thick even the wind seemed to slow. 8 years of distance stood between them, needing no explanation. Matthias felt his chest tighten by instinct. He gave a nod, a gesture polite enough to raise a wall. Morel saw it at once. She understood immediately. But she did not expose it, did not step forward, did not step back. She stayed where she was, allowing the distance to remain just as he wished. She spoke a short sentence, her voice low and clear. She said she needed a place to stay for a while. She said the road behind her no longer offered a way back. She said that if he agreed, she would take care of her own share of the work. There was no pleading, no long explanation. Matthias answered in brief lines. He said the ranch was struggling. He said water was scarce. He said he could promise nothing. Each sentence was another brick laid into his defenses. Morel listened and nodded, as though she had expected no less. When she walked along the dirt path toward the house, the space between them did not close, but it was no longer as wide as before. That afternoon, Matthias worked harder than usual. He repaired a fence post, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. Once he looked up and caught sight of Morel setting her belongings down on the porch. She did not look at him, but when the wind rose sharply, she held her ground and stayed upright. A small gesture, enough for him to understand she was not a visitor who would come and go. Evening fell, thin red light spreading over cracked earth. Matthias stood in the doorway, listening to the ranch breathe. A slow, unwelcome thought crept in. She had not come back to visit, not to reopen old matters. She had come back to stay, through a season of drought, on land close to collapse, beside a man who had forgotten how to dream. He did not know whether that would bring salvation or another burden, He only knew that from the moment the coach stopped at the bend in the road, the Wardell Ranch was no longer a place where he stood alone against the wind. The days that followed moved slowly, as if time itself had grown weary from the drought. Morel did not stay at the Wardell Ranch more than necessary. She crossed the dry creek to help her relatives, land smaller, soil poorer, and signs of exhaustion so clear they needed no questions. Low barns, leaning fences, an empty well. She worked from morning to late afternoon, her hands growing used to heavy labor, her sleeves darkened with sweat. When dusk came, she returned, passing the edge of Matthias's land, her steps slowing by a single beat. Matthias noticed. He did not ask. But on the third day, when a fence post on her side collapsed, he carried a hammer across. "Neighbor," he said, his voice level, as if it were the only safe reason to cross the line. Morel nodded. "Thank you," she replied. Nothing more. They stood a careful distance apart, working in opposite directions, the strikes of their hammers uneven, yet keeping the same time. Digging under the noon sun made the air shimmer. Dust clung to skin and hair. Once their hands brushed as they pulled a plank together. Both froze, then both pulled back, quick enough to pretend it had not happened. Their eyes met for a brief second, then slipped away. Matthias bent down, focused on a bent nail. Morel adjusted her gloves, her back turned to him. No one smiled, no one apologized. Their words were few and short. "Put it there. Careful. That's enough. Polite. Clean." And beneath them a thin cut neither of them named. Matthias thought of a morning 8 years earlier, of a rented room left hollow, of a chair against the wall no longer bearing the shape of a back. No farewell, no note. Only absence. He had told himself he understood. People leave because they can. But the thought had stayed, heavy and hard, like a stone in his pocket. Morel carried her own weight. Afternoons spent by a window, rereading lines she had written, waiting for a reply that never came. She had believed silence was the answer, that what they had was enough to begin, not enough to keep. In the city, she learned to stand straight, to manage on her own, to stop asking why. Still, when she was tired, memory returned, the dry land, the wide sky, and a man who spoke less than he felt. At midday, resting beneath the low porch shade, Morel handed him a canteen. Matthias took it, his fingers touching the cold metal. He drank once and passed it back. "You don't have to do that," he said, nodding at the pile of lumber. "I'm helping because I have time." Morel looked at him, her gaze neither accusing nor soft. "So am I," she answered. Then she stood first, leaving behind words not yet understood in the right way. The afternoon wind shifted. A young calf slipped free of the pen and ran toward the newly fixed fence. Matthias moved faster. Morel followed. As he bent to block the way, the animal startled and lost its footing. Morel reacted, holding the rope, her shoulder tightening. Matthias caught up in time. They stood very close, their breath touching. In that moment, neither spoke. There was only a heartbeat out of rhythm and a familiarity sharp enough to be uncomfortable. When things settled, Morel said quietly, as if to herself, "In the city, people don't have time to be tired." The words fell between them without emphasis, without complaint. Matthias looked up. "Is that so?" he asked. Morel nodded. "There's no room for mistakes. No one waits." Matthias said nothing. He looked at her hands, new calluses, a cut not yet healed. In his mind, the city had always been easier, a place where light softened lack. Her words opened a small crack in the wall he had built over the years. Not enough to bring it down, but enough to let some light through. Evening came again. The work was finished. They stood at their familiar distance. As Morel turned away, Matthias spoke her name. Once, so softly the wind could have taken it. She stopped, not turning back. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll come over early." Morel nodded. She did not smile. But her steps were a little lighter, as if something had just been set down, very gently. That morning began with a sound that did not belong. Not wind, not cattle. It was water. A sharp, ragged rhythm, like breath being cut short. Matthias froze in the yard and listened. The sound came from the old dam, where the creek that once sustained the whole region had been reduced to a thin strip, held back by wooden planks long past their strength. He did not think for long. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He grabbed his coat, took rope and hammer, and ran. If the dam broke, the well would dry, the cattle would die faster, and this land, not just the Wardle Ranch, would have nothing left to hold on to. His breath grew heavy as hard ground struck underfoot. Morel was across the creek when she heard it. Not her name, wood splitting. She looked toward the dam and saw Matthias already there, bent low, hands gripping a shaking plank. Water forced its way through the gap, quiet but relentless. Morel did not hesitate. She ran, lifting her skirt just enough, boots slipping in the wet mud. "Go back!" Matthias shouted, his voice torn by wind and water. Morel did not stop. She set her shoulder against the board he was holding, driving her weight into it. Water splashed up, icy cold. They worked without words, pulling, bracing, tying. Old wood groaned, as if resisting every effort to keep it in place. Matthias saw the gap widening. He cursed under his breath. Not enough material, not enough time. A plank slipped. Morel lost her footing. Water surged and caught her leg. The moment did not last long, but long enough for everything to narrow into pure reflex. Matthias dropped the hammer and lunged. His hand closed around her wrist, crushing tight. The water yanked hard. Mud gave way. He braced himself, back rigid, feet dug into the bank. Morel held on, teeth clenched, her shoulders shaking with cold and fear. Then they pulled free. Both collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping for air. The water still pushed through, but slower now, slow enough to buy time. Matthias lay on his side, eyes shut, listening to his heart pound. Morel pushed herself upright, clothes soaked, hair plastered to her face. They looked at each other from very close, breath mingling in the cold air. No one said thank you. No one smiled. Those words were too small for what had just passed. Matthias stood first and turned back to the dam, motioning. Morel followed. They worked again, slower this time, more careful. The rope was tied tight. Stones were wedged behind the plank. The water eased, not defeated, but wary. When things finally settled, sunlight broke through, catching on the droplets clinging to their sleeves. They were spent. Matthias sat down with his back against the bank. Morel stood for a moment, then sat as well, a short distance away. She watched the dam as one might watch a creature that had just been calmed. Matthias looked at her hands, trembling slightly, mud under the nails, a fresh scrape red against her skin. A thought crossed him, clear and unwelcome. She was not weak. She never had been, not in the way he once believed. "You could have been swept away," he said quietly. Morel nodded. "So could you," she answered. "No more, no less." The wind shifted. The scent of wet earth spread, rare and welcome. Matthias realized he was still gripping the end of the rope, as if unwilling to let go. He released it slowly. Morel stood and held out her hand. He hesitated for a beat, then took it. The grip was brief, firm, no longer than needed. But as they walked away from the dam, side by side, The space between them was no longer the same. On the way back, neither spoke. Yet in that silence, something had shifted. Matthias no longer saw Morel as a guest in need of protection, and Morel, when she glanced over, saw in him not just a wall of defense, but a man who could stand his ground, and who knew how to hold on when it mattered, without needing to think. The sound came at dusk, when the light had thinned and everything inside the barn had begun to take on the color of shadow. It was not livestock. Matthias knew at once. It was breathing, fast and low, scraping against wood. He stopped in the narrow aisle and listened. The animal was there, not loud, not panicked, just present, careful, as if it knew it was in the wrong place. Matthias took the rifle from its hook on the post. Habit. He had done this often enough not to think. Wild animals that wandered into the barn rarely brought anything good, but as he stepped closer, the oil lamp caught a shape curled in the dark corner. A young wolf, ribs heaving, one hind leg dragged uselessly behind it. Its eyes were wide, not feral, only wary. Blood had soaked into the gray fur, dark and dry. He stopped, close enough to end it quickly. Far enough not to look for long. Morel appeared at the barn door without a sound. She stood still, one hand resting on the wooden frame, taking in the scene. Matthias felt her presence like a shift in the air. He did not turn. The rifle was heavy in his hands, familiar, steady, a clean choice, a simple one. The wolf shifted and let out a low sound. Matthias clenched his jaw. Old images rose up, his father, long winters, windless nights when cruelty was called necessity. He had learned survival in its plainest form: shoot, clear it out, move on. But now, his finger did not tighten on the trigger. Morel said nothing. She took one slow step forward, letting the lamplight fall across the animal's face. "It's wounded," she said, evenly. Not an argument, just a fact. Matthias knew. He looked at the injury and judged it. It might live. It might not. The hesitation grew heavier, not because of the wolf, but because of something deeper, harder to name. He felt Morel's gaze on his back, not urging, not judging, just there. He lowered the rifle carefully. The wolf did not lunge. It drew in on itself, as if it did not trust this change. Matthias set the gun against the post and took out bandages. His hands worked with precision but slower than usual. When he moved closer, the animal growled softly. Morel extended her hand, palm open, stopping short of contact. No touch, just presence. "We don't need to scare it more," she said. Then she was quiet. They worked within that silence. Matthias bound the wound, quick and clean. The wolf trembled, then settled. When it was done, he stepped back and let out a breath. There was no victory in it. Only a different ending, one that did not yet know where it would lead. Morel looked at him, her expression softening without display. "Some things," she said slowly, "don't need to be destroyed. They only need to be understood." The words fell like a small stone into still water. No splash, but the reach was wide. Matthias turned back to the wolf, alive, hurt, watchful. The sight was familiar enough to unsettle him. He realized he had lived the same way for years, standing firm, jaw set, keeping distance, ready to strike, not out of savagery, but out of fear. They opened the barn door. The wolf shifted, then dragged itself out, disappearing into the dark. When the door closed, the barn felt emptier, but not lighter. Matthias stood still, one hand braced against the wooden post, as if he needed something solid. Morel remained a moment longer, then turned away without another word. She knew when to leave. That night, Matthias did not sleep. He lay listening to the wind, the creak of wood, the steady knocking of the past. Old images returned. Quick decisions, clean endings, never looking back. Morel's words repeated themselves, not loud, not forgiving, only opening a different path he had never taken. Out there, the wolf might live, or it might not. But in the dark house, a man began to understand that not everything needs to end with a gunshot, and that understanding, slow, heavy, kept him awake until morning. The storm arrived at the end of the day, without warning. The sky darkened as though someone had drawn a heavy cloth across land already worn thin by drought. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a rare scent of moisture, and then thunder rolled in from afar, low and long. Matthias barely finished closing the barn doors before the rain came down, heavy drops falling straight and hard, as if they had waited too long to be released. Morel was forced to stay inside. The dirt road outside quickly turned slick with mud, no longer safe to cross. She stood near the window, watching the rain pour across the porch, her hand tightening on her skirt without realizing it. When thunder cracked directly overhead, she flinched slightly, not loudly, not openly, just an old reflex. Matthias noticed when he stepped into the room. He did not ask. He added another log to the stove and secured the loose window latch. The wooden house trembled under the wind, rain drumming steadily on the roof. Morel sat in the chair near the fire, back straight, eyes fixed on the flames. When thunder sounded again, her shoulders drew in just a little. He pulled another chair closer and set it at a careful distance. No touch, no attempt to soothe her with big words, just presence. The fire burned steadily, light shifting across their faces, softening features long held tight. Silence stretched. Rain swallowed every other sound. Morel breathed slowly, as if counting. "I don't like storms," she said quietly, as if naming it was enough. Matthias nodded. "I know," he replied, though she had never told him before. Lightning split the sky. Morel closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. "When I was a child," she said, looking into the fire, "every time thunder came, I thought everything would fall apart. The adults said it would pass, but back then, nothing felt certain." She paused. She did not need to say more. The memory hung in the room, clear enough on its own. Matthias listened, his hands resting on his knees, fingers curling slightly. "My father," he said after a while, "loved deeply, and he believed that was enough. He swallowed. When things broke, he couldn't stand back up. The wind struck the walls. I learned to stay upright by never going there." Morel turned to him, not with pity, not with surprise. "So you're afraid to love," she said, naming what had stood between them since the first day. Matthias did not deny it. He watched the fire as a piece of wood collapsed inward with a soft crack. "I'm afraid of destroying what's left," he said, "and of myself." The rain kept falling. The storm did not ease right away. Morel took a deep breath. "I came back," she said, "because in the city, people live side by side without ever touching. No one waits. No one stays when things get hard." She gave a faint smile without joy. "I'm tired of pretending I'm fine." Matthias listened, and something in his chest loosened. He did not reach out, did not move closer. He only shifted his chair slightly, so the space between them remained, but no longer felt like a wall. Thunder sounded again, farther away. This time Morel did not flinch. Her gaze softened, her shoulders lowered. They sat like that until the rain began to thin. No promises, no decisions. Only truths laid between them, bare and without demand. When the storm passed, the house still stood. And in the final quiet, Matthias understood something simple he had long avoided. There are nights when what is needed most is not a solution, but someone who stays, not touching, not speaking much, just close enough that fear no longer rules the room. The physical distance remained, but somewhere deeper, the distance between their hearts had given way, quietly, like rain finally coming to an end. The storm passed and left behind a different kind of silence. Not a gentle calm, but an emptiness still humming, as if the ground remembered the thunder. The wooden house held the scent of fresh damp mixed with wood from a fire just gone out. Matthias stood at the doorway, looking outside. The moon rose late, thin light spreading across a yard still streaked with water. Morel stood behind him, saying nothing. They had spoken enough for one night. This silence carried a charge. It did not push them apart. It held them in place. Matthias turned first, very slowly. Their eyes met. No testing, no challenge. Only recognition. He took one step and stopped. The space between them remained wide enough for either to retreat if they chose. Morel did not step back. She stayed where she was, arms loose at her sides, shoulders eased. A choice was made and accepted without words. The touch came like a breath. The back of Matthias's hand brushed hers as he passed to close the window. Not deliberate, not marked, but he did not pull away. Morel looked down, then up again. Her eyes asked what speech did not need to. Matthias nodded, barely. They sat beside each other, not close. The fire had settled into embers. Outside, the wind breathed evenly. Matthias spoke once, slowly, as if laying a foundation. If we go forward, I don't know that I'll do everything right. Morel answered, calm and steady. I don't need right. I need real. Closeness followed in small measures. No rush, no taking. A hand resting on the back of a chair, then on a shoulder, a breath shared. When Matthias touched her hair, he stopped and waited. Morel tilted her head slightly. A small motion, enough to say she was here and willing. They kissed like people returning from a long distance, unhurried, without demand. Each moment tested the same question. Are you staying? Do you still trust? The intimacy of the night opened not through sudden passion, but through repeated choice. Choosing to stay when turning away was possible. Choosing slowness so nothing was lost. Choosing to believe the risk was worth it. Matthias felt the fragility of the moment clearly, and that awareness made him careful. Morel met him with a steadiness earned through years of standing on her own. They met in the middle, where neither had to be stronger than the other. Time moved without needing to be counted. There were pauses to breathe, to look, to be certain this was not a temporary escape. When they lay back, the moon had climbed higher, casting thin bands of light across the wooden ceiling. Matthias lay on his side, listening to Morel's breathing, even and close. Her hand rested on his chest, not holding, only present. It won't be easy, he said quietly. Morel did not open her eyes. I know, she replied, but I'm here. The words promised nothing beyond the truth of the moment. And that was enough. No vows, no large plans, only the recognition that from this point on, they were no longer standing on opposite sides of fear. With dawn still far off, Matthias realized something so clear it brought a faint smile in the dark. He was no longer running. And Morel, half asleep, shifted closer. An unthinking movement, but a decisive one. After this night, neither of them could pretend as before. The fences had come down, without noise, without collapse, simply gone, leaving a path wide enough for two people to walk together into the coming day. Morning arrived gently, as if afraid to wake something fragile. Sunlight slipped through the curtain gap and fell in thin bands across the wooden floor, still holding the night's damp. The house was quiet in a different way, not the familiar loneliness, but a space being filled by the breathing of two people. Matthias woke first. He lay still, listening. Mirelle slept, turned slightly toward him, her hair resting softly on the pillow. The moment made him want to keep everything exactly as it was, like holding a door open at just the right angle. But at the same time, practical thoughts arrived, slow and steady, like footsteps on a dirt road. The ranch was still dry. The dam was only temporarily braced. The bank would not wait because of one peaceful night. He stared at the ceiling, counting dark knots in the wood, and wondered what he was bringing this woman besides worry. Last night's closeness had not erased daylight calculations. It had only made them sharper. Mirelle stirred, then opened her eyes. She looked at him for a beat before smiling, a small smile, as if confirming that the night needed no explanation. She sat up, pulled her jacket around her shoulders, and stepped quietly onto the floor. "I'll heat the water," she said. Her voice was steady, no avoidance, no clinging. In the kitchen, early light revealed old scratches on the table. Mirelle set the kettle on the stove, her movements sure. Matthias leaned against the doorway, watching the way she worked. Natural, not taking space, like someone who knew exactly where she fit. Warmth rose in him, then was pressed down by a heavy question. Was he enough to keep this? They ate a simple breakfast, dry bread, strong coffee. No one mentioned the night before. Not from fear, but because both understood that saying it aloud would not make it stronger. Mirelle looked out at the yard, where pooled water reflected the sky. "The rain helped some," she said. Matthias nodded. "Not enough." The answer opened a quiet space. Mirelle set her cup down and turned to him. "What will you do?" she asked without probing. Matthias considered. "I'll try to hold the dam a few more days," he said. "Then, wait for the letters." She listened and nodded. She did not press. But in her eyes, Matthias saw a different worry. Not about water or money, but about him. Mirelle feared that when the day rose higher and the numbers came into view, he would retreat. Not from the ranch, but from her. She had seen it before, in people who chose safety over presence. She rested her hand on the table, fingers touching an old scratch, reminding herself to stay upright. She did not want to hold on, but she did not want to be left in silence either. Matthias stood first. "I need to go check the dam," he said. Ordinary words, but the way he avoided her eyes carried hesitation. Mirelle caught it. "I'll come with you," she replied. No pleading, no challenge, just an offer made as an equal. Outside, the morning wind was cooler. They walked side by side, not touching. Matthias thought about the space between them, thin but still there. He wanted to say something to keep her closer, but words tangled in worry. Mirelle walked at her own pace, neither ahead nor behind. At the dam, the water ran calmer than the day before. Matthias bent to check the ropes. Mirelle stood nearby, watching. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "I didn't come back to be protected." Matthias looked up. She continued, meeting his eyes. "I came back to work together." The words reached him differently. They did not solve debt. They did not call rain. But they set a ground he could stand on without feeling lacking. Matthias nodded. "I won't promise easy," he said. "I'll only promise honest." Mirelle nodded, accepting it as a temporary pact. Enough for today. The morning moved on, calm in a cautious way. Happiness was there, clear, but fragile, like water held back by rope. No one knew how long it would last. They only knew that, in that early light, they chose to keep walking beside each other, each carrying their own worries, and that choice alone kept the day from collapsing at the start. The woman arrived at noon, under a punishing sun. when the air stood still as if held in place by its own heat. The hired carriage stopped at the gate of the Wardle Ranch, its wheels so clean they looked out of place against the thick dust. Matthias saw it from a distance and knew at once. This woman did not belong here. She stepped down neatly, posture straight, dark dress untouched by dirt. A foreign perfume drifted into the dry yard on the wind. Morel came out of the house before him, lifting a hand to shield her eyes. Her gaze paused for a very brief moment, long enough for Matthias to understand this was not a casual visit. "Aunt Clarice," Morel said, keeping her voice at the level of necessary courtesy. The woman smiled, a practiced smile meant to be both warm and distant. "You look different," she said, her eyes flicking quickly from Morel's face to her mud-stained boots and back again. "But you look well." Matthias stepped forward and introduced himself. Clarice shook his hand quickly, just long enough to complete the formality. As she spoke polite phrases, her eyes took in the ranch, the patched fences, the sagging barns, the cracks along the porch. No direct judgment, but nothing went unnoticed. They sat in the front room. Clarice set her leather bag beside the chair and opened conversations about the city. Paved streets, steady work, evenings lit by lamps and music. Morel listened and nodded, not arguing. Matthias sat slightly apart, hands clasped together, feeling as though he were present at a meeting not meant for him. "I came to offer a solution," Clarice said at last, plainly. "Not to take you away, Morel. Just to open a door." She drew out an envelope and placed it on the table. "There's capital, enough for you to begin again, somewhere that doesn't depend on rain." No one touched the envelope. Morel looked at it, then at Matthias. He avoided her eyes. In his mind, numbers rose up. The temporary dam, the bank, winter. Clarice's voice continued, even and steady. "You're capable. You've endured enough. Staying here will cost you many things. Not everyone should have to sacrifice." Matthias felt his throat tighten. She wasn't wrong. He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred. What he had to offer was always thin promises. Doubt crept in, quiet but persistent. If Morel accepted, he would understand. Part of him believed she should. Morel stayed silent for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the window. Light fell across her back, sharpening her outline. "You're right about ease," she said. "But you didn't speak about the price." Clarice tilted her head. "What price?" "The price of no longer recognizing yourself," Morel answered. She turned back and rested her hand on the back of Matthias's chair, not touching him, just close enough. "It's hard here, but I know what I'm doing, and I'm not doing it alone." Matthias looked up. Their eyes met for a brief beat, then moved away. Clarice let out a breath, her smile thinning. "You're speaking for him," she said. "Are you sure he wants to keep you here?" The question turned directly to Matthias. He stood slowly. "I'm not keeping anyone," he said. "I just don't have anything to hide." His voice stayed low, but firm. "If Morel stays, it's because she chooses to. Not because I promise an easy life." Clarice studied him longer. For the first time, her gaze softened a fraction. She folded the envelope but did not put it away. "I don't want my niece to suffer," she said to Morel, "and I don't want her coming back in a few years with empty hands." Morel nodded. "I understand, but empty isn't having no money. Empty is having nothing to stand beside." She placed her hand on the table near the envelope without touching it. "If I leave for myself. If I stay, it's the same." The conversation ended without victory or defeat. Clarice stood and adjusted her gloves. "Think about it," she said. "The door won't close right away." She looked at Matthias once more. And you should think too. Don't let pride turn into chains. When the carriage drove off, dust filled the yard again. Matthias stood still, a heavy weight settling on his shoulders. If you accept, he said without looking at Morel, I'll understand. She stepped closer, stopping in front of him. I don't need you to understand it that way, she said. I need you to trust that I'm not here because I lack options. Matthias nodded, though the fear remained, the fear of becoming a burden, the fear of that envelope returning. Still, in Morel's eyes, he saw a decision that had not been bought. And that truth both comforted him and made one thing clear. From here on, every choice would have to be carried honestly, no hiding behind costly offers ever again. The letter arrived on a windless morning. The mailman set it on the kitchen table as if placing down something heavy enough to crack the wood. An ivory envelope, clean print, the seal pressed tight over every loose hope. Matthias saw it at once, and knew what it was before he opened it. He did not open it right away. The coffee went cold in his cup. Sunlight cut across the window and stopped on the envelope like a reminder that did not need words. At last, he slid his thumb along the edge, slow and precise. The lines inside were blunt, politely cruel, a deadline, a sum, a procedure. No room for negotiation, no space for rain. Matthias folded the letter. His chest tightened, not from surprise, but from confirmation. What he had always known had finally arrived. He stood and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was already high, the yard dry, the air still. That stillness made everything clearer than it needed to be. Morel found him by the eastern fence. He was fixing a post that no longer needed fixing, a way to keep his hands busy when his thoughts were overloaded. The bank letter? She asked, without seeing the envelope. Matthias nodded. The last one, he said. She stood beside him, not touching, understanding that sometimes distance is respect. They walked along the fence line. Matthias spoke of numbers, of deadlines. His voice was steady, without defense. Morel listened, eyes on the dirt path ahead. When he finished, she said, We'll find a way. Matthias shook his head. There is no we for this. The words dropped like stone. Morel stopped. What did you say? Matthias turned away, staring across the dry field. I'm not pulling you into this, he said. I won't let you carry it. The words sounded like responsibility, but underneath them was fear. Fear of trapping her. Fear of becoming the burden the city woman had quietly named. Morel stepped forward and blocked his view. You're deciding for me, she said, not raising her voice. That isn't protection. Matthias clenched his hands. It's the only thing I can do. He spoke of winters, of nights counting money, of selling what little he could and still coming up short. If I step back, he went on, you'll have a cleaner choice. That door is still open. Morel looked at him for a long time. There was pain in her eyes, but no surprise. Do you think I stayed because I had no options? She said. Or because I chose you? Matthias did not answer at once. The silence stretched, tight as a rope. At last, he said the hardest thing. I'm not enough. Saying it lightened him for a moment, then made him heavier. Not enough money, not enough safety, not enough to promise. Morel drew a slow breath. You're enough to be present, she said. Enough to be honest, enough to work alongside. She rested her hand on the wooden post, an old splinter scar visible. I don't need you to protect me by disappearing. Matthias shook his head. You deserve more. The afternoon passed under a quiet truce. Matthias worked until exhaustion, as if weariness might decide for him. As dusk came on, he went home alone, leaving Morel with her relatives. That night, he wrote a short note, plain, careful, polite, saying he needed time. It did not lie. It did not say enough. The next morning, he avoided her. Took the horse out early, worked far from the house. The instinct to let go ran like an old machine, cut clean to lessen the pain, but it did not lessen. Each step carried the image of Morel standing in front of him, telling him that this was not protection. By noon, Morel found him near the dry creek bed. She brought no persuasion. She only stood there. "You can choose to step away," she said, "but don't call it doing this for me." Matthias closed his eyes. "I'm afraid," he admitted, for the first time without shielding it. "Afraid of losing everything." "You'll lose me if you decide for me," she answered. Not a threat, just a fact spoken plainly. The wind moved lightly, carrying the scent of dust. Matthias opened his eyes. The bank letter was still there, like a shadow. But beside it stood another truth. Letting go does not always save anyone. Sometimes it only saves the ego from staying and carrying the weight together. He did not answer right away, but he did not turn away again. And for the first time since the envelope touched the table, he allowed himself to think that protection does not have to mean disappearance. The change did not begin with a grand decision, but with small footsteps. That morning, when Matthias reached the dam earlier than usual, he saw wagon tracks pressed into the dirt road. Not his, not Morel's. Then another set, and a man waiting by the creek, one hand on a shovel, hat pulled low. "Heard the dam needs more stone," the man said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Matthias recognized the town blacksmith, someone who rarely left his forge. Before Matthias could answer, another voice came from behind. "I brought rope." Then another, and another. No noise, no rallying cry. They came because word had spread, and because they understood. If the water went, it would not leave only the Wardell ranch. Matthias stood still a moment too long. Old instinct rose. Refuse, retreat, keep control. But Morel was there, beside him, not urging, not speaking for him. She only nodded to those who arrived, as if greeting something long overdue. They worked through the morning. Stones passed hand to hand, rope pulled tight, a new plank wedged into an old gap. No one asked why Matthias had not spoken sooner. No one counted who owed whom. When one man slipped, two others steadied him. When a rope snapped, more rope appeared. The water ran calmer, as if it too sensed it no longer faced a single man. Near midday, a woman brought water, then bread. No one lingered. They ate standing, spoke briefly. Matthias looked around, a strange feeling settling in, not relief, but the opening of a space he had never allowed. He was used to carrying alone, used to paying alone. Accepting help made him feel exposed, as though his shortcomings were laid bare. Morel saw it. When he stepped back, she moved forward and handed him the hammer. "They came for the water," she said quietly, "not to measure you." Matthias nodded, drew a breath, and stepped back in. He took the hammer, and with it, the steady looks of trust from those around him. That afternoon, the bank's man passed through town. Word moved quickly. A shop owner offered to extend credit. A rancher across the fields offered to lend cattle through the dry season. Small things, not enough to erase debt, but enough to build a bridge across the days ahead. Matthias listened and learned to say thank you without feeling smaller. As the sun dropped, the dam stood firmer than it had that morning. Not perfect, but real. People left one by one, leaving the creek bank marked with overlapping boot prints. Matthias stood with his hand on the newly braced post, feeling its strength. He turned to Morel. "I didn't know," he said. She gave a small smile. You didn't ask. That evening they sat on the porch. The wind carried a rare scent of damp earth. Matthias looked out at the yard, where the wagon tracks were already fading. I thought taking help meant debt, he said. Something to be repaid somehow. Morel shook her head. Some things are repaid by staying. The next day, the community returned. Fewer people, clearer tasks. One fixed the roof, another mended the barn. Matthias assigned work and listened to suggestions. At times he stopped and let others do things their way. Each time something rigid in him cracked, not breaking, but opening. By afternoon, the bank letter still lay on the table. It had not vanished. But when Matthias picked it up, he no longer felt alone before it. He folded it, set it down, and stepped back onto the porch. Morel was speaking with a neighbor, pointing to a sketch of the temporary dam. He walked over and stood beside her, not stepping away. For the first time, Matthias understood that strength was not only in enduring to the end. Sometimes it was in allowing others to stand with you when you were tired. The community had not solved everything for him, but they had done something more important. They had broken the circle of solitude he had drawn around himself for years. As dusk settled over the Wardell ranch, Matthias rested his hand on the porch rail, feeling the solid wood beneath his palm. He was not alone, not because someone had rescued him, but because he had learned to open the door and let them in. The wedding took place on a cloudless morning, when the ground was still dry, and the breeze blew just enough to soften the early heat. There were no flowers brought in from town, no music carried on the wind. Only the yard in front of the house, swept clean of dust, borrowed chairs from neighbors set in short rows. Everything was so simple it could almost have been overlooked, but no one overlooked it. Morel stepped out from the small room at the back. She wore a plain dress, tailored to fit, with no extra adornment. Light touched her dark skin and brought out the steadiness that had followed her since her return. No one took her arm. She walked alone, slow and sure, as someone long accustomed to standing on her own feet. When her eyes found Matthias, a very slight smile appeared. Not the smile of a moment, but of a decision. Matthias waited at the end of the rows. Clean shirt, sleeves rolled, hat in his hands. He watched Morel approach, the familiar weight of worry still present, but no longer consuming him. Behind him stood the ranch, the newly braced posts, the patched roof, the dam holding better than it had the day before. Not perfect, but real. The officiant spoke little. There was no talk of miracles, no promises of ease, only questions simple enough to confirm what the two already knew. When it was Matthias's turn, he drew a breath and looked straight at Morel. I promise to stay, he said, his voice not loud, but clear. To stay when the rain comes, and when it doesn't. To stay and build and mend and carry the weight together. Morel answered without hurry. I promise to choose staying, she said. Not because I lack other paths, but because this is where I want to put my hands to the work and my heart with the person. She paused for a beat, to build together, to carry together. There was no loud applause, only nods, a few quiet exhalations of relief. When they exchanged rings, plain, unadorned, the sunlight caught the metal without glare. Matthias slipped the ring onto Morel's finger with the same hands that once trembled from fear of dropping everything. This time his hands were steady. After the ceremony, no one rushed away. There was bread and coffee. Someone brought more water. Children ran circles in the yard, dust clinging to their cuffs. Morel laughed and spoke easily, not as a stranger. Matthias stood beside her, listening, learning how to let joy exist without fearing it would be taken. By midday, as the guests thinned, They sat together on the porch steps. The wind carried the scent of earth. Morel rested her shoulder against Matthias without speaking. He laid his hand over hers and felt the steady rhythm of life there. "It will still be hard," he said. Morel nodded. "I know." She turned to him. "But hard isn't alone anymore." The afternoon passed with small tasks, a fence to adjust, a post to brace. They worked together without fixed roles. When a board didn't fit, they tried again. When tired, they stopped. No one pushed. No one walked away. Evening spread over the Wardle Ranch, warming the dry land with its light. Matthias looked around, overlapping boot prints, repairs still unfinished. He thought about the promise he had just spoken. Not a promise to make things easy, but a promise not to leave when things became hard. Morel stood beside him, her gaze calm. "Tomorrow," she said, "we keep working." Matthias nodded. "Tomorrow," he replied. The wedding ended not with a long kiss before the crowd, but with 2 steps taken in the same direction, slow and certain. On dry ground, with the wind moving lightly, they chose a simple promise: to stay, to build, to carry together, and let it begin its work the very next day. Many years passed in a way only this dry land could understand. Not in great leaps, but in repeating seasons. Rain coming and going, wind shifting, the earth cracking and closing again. The Wardell Ranch did not become anything remarkable. It simply stood firmer. Posts once only braced were now replaced. The dam no longer groaned when the water rose. In good years, the creek learned how to run steady. Mornings began with the sound of children's feet on the porch. One ran ahead, another followed, their short, sharp laughter like small stones tossed into water. Morel stood in the kitchen, tying her hair back, setting a pot on the stove. Matthias worked in the yard, fixing a latch. When he stepped inside, one child clung to his trouser leg and looked up to ask a question that did not need an answer. He bent down and answered by lifting the child onto his hip, a gesture that had become habit. A family formed through such small acts. There were no bright markers to announce it, only meals with everyone present, evenings drawn close together when the wind pressed hard. Winters passed without anyone disappearing. Morel worked as she always had, hands in every task, keeping the rhythm of the house. Matthias learned when to step back and when to step forward. They did not divide roles with words. They let the work speak. The ranch recovered without noise. It did not hide its hardships. Some years brought little rain. Some years the cattle fell sick. But the community remained. Familiar faces stopping by, hands ready when needed. Matthias no longer hesitated to open the door. He learned to call help by name, as one calls a friend, not as one records a debt. Some afternoons, when the sun dropped low and shadows stretched long, Matthias stood by the creek and watched the water move. He remembered the days when all he knew was how to count losses, count debts, count how to stand one more night. Back then, survival was everything. All else, dreams, joy, was set aside for safety. Now he did not forget the calculations, but they no longer filled the whole space. Morel came to stand beside him, her hand resting on the rail. She said nothing. Her presence was enough to draw him back to the present, where laughter drifted from the yard, where the house held the smell of supper nearly done. He looked at her, then toward the small footprints pressed into the dirt. "We made it," he said, not to declare, but to recognize. Morel nodded. "We stayed," she answered. Night fell, and they sat on the porch. The children were asleep. The wind carried the rare scent of damp earth. Matthias told Morel about a day long ago, when he stood alone at the old dam, his hands shaking with the knowledge that no one was coming. She listened without correcting, without adding. When he fell quiet, she laid her hand over his, a familiar gesture, needing no emphasis. In that moment, Matthias understood what he had learned, not how to defeat hardship, but how to live within it without shrinking. Living was not only enduring. Living was allowing joy to exist beside worry. It was naming fear without letting it rule. It was staying, not because there was nowhere else to go, but because this was the road he had chosen. Tomorrow would come, as it always did. There would be work to do. There would be seasons to cross. But when Matthias rose and turned toward the house, he knew he was not walking into the dark alone. The kitchen light was still on. A soft voice called his name. He answered, steady. And if there were one line to close those years, it was the line he learned by living, not by hearing. Some people do not save us from hardship. They simply give us the courage not to face it alone.